Now, this chapter actually focuses mainly on socialism. It starts with actually Karl Marx, which is the Marxism, right? So you guys probably know a lot about Marxism. You probably have heard about it. Your book, actually, this chapter overlaps a lot socialism and communism, but socialism is not 100% communism. In socialism, you still can own some small private sectors, very small private sectors. But communism, everything is owned by government. Like its distribution, everything is by government, equal for everybody else, for the mass population. Now, let's start with historical development of socialism. The 20th century. The 20th century, when 20th century started, actually, it was supposed to be the century of communism. Why? Because capitalism had a lot of flaws in 1800. And I'm going to tell you how the socialism started. Remember we said late 1800 was the time that government of United States decided to intervene and implement like Sherman-Clayton Act's law of against monopoly, blah, blah, right? It was because the capitalism that was at that time, it was very different than the way we know today. At that time, it was exploitation, and they called it capitalism. It was no rules and regulations. Remember we said, we have a lot of rules right now. We have minimum wage, good working conditions for workers. You know, workers have rights based on unions or government federal regulations. At that time, the reason Karl Marx started actually his work of Das Kapital, which is very famous, it's on YouTube, everybody can watch it too. The reason he started, he basically was against that extreme, like the lands were all owned by owners and the work was, the wages were extremely minimal because it was not minimum wage, right? So wages were extremely minimal, working conditions were extremely poor. It was slavery everywhere, colonies, exploitation. So when you think, and when Industrial Revolution started, a lot of poor working conditions and dangerous working conditions for employees, for workers, for laborers, because they would have serious accidents with machines, and nobody was responsible for it. So when we talk about capitalism and socialism at that time, in 19th centuries, 1800s, it's very different than the view we have today. Because of the extreme exploitation at that time, he started basically, Karl Marx started with Das Kapital, which is capitalism, which he was against it, so he started with socialism. He basically said it has to be minimum wage, laborers have to have some laws protecting them, you cannot exploit them, good working conditions, no child labor. So he was basically based on those policies, which we have today, but at that time it was too extreme for that environment. Now, when communism started, as I said, that was the capitalism, like exploitation. So therefore, they believed the future will be communism. So the 20th century, they believed that communism should take over the world because capitalism is based on exploitation. And also, World War I contributed to the advent of communism. It actually helped the communism to grow. 1930s mass unemployment in the US convinced people communism is the future. So all of these factors actually contributed to the ideology of communism. Communism first, it was an ideology, and then it was implemented into the politics, political, and economic power. After World War II, now the world was divided between two superpowers. Half of the world literally followed or was under influence of Soviet Union, and the other half of the world, Western world, was under the influence of the United States. By the end of 1980s, countries ruled by Communist Party accounted for 34% of the world population and 31% of the world's land area. So did you know that we had so many countries around the world that were communism? Probably the only one that you guys had in mind was Soviet Union, former Soviet Union. But former Soviet Union influenced half of the Eastern world. So half of the world, which was Eastern world. And United States, Western world. Now, Why do we call them superpower? Because communism actually, former Soviet Union focused a lot on industries and it was military mainly. So they completely basically forgot about consumer goods, agriculture, farming, but the focus was entirely on military power. That's how they became a superpower. Utopian society, I don't know, have you guys heard about utopian society? Like the imaginary, basically, extremely good society, for example. Equality everywhere, all the resources are available for everybody. It's just an imaginary society. It's fictitious. It doesn't exist. So they were trying to get there. They were trying to get into utopian society. That was the plan. An imaginary perfect society in which social, economic, environmental, and scientific conditions were ideal for the entire community and not only one group of people. It was contrary to individualism. Poverty will lead to sin, because they believe that poverty will lead to sin. So that's why they believe it should be equality. Because if there is a huge gap, and most of the times if you think about it, when there is a huge gap between poor and rich, you see that crime rate increases, right? If everybody is poor or everybody is rich, there will be no crime, right? So when there is a gap between poor and rich, that's how the crime rate increases. That's what they believed in. Poverty will lead to sin. Governments and churches are responsible to help the poor to bring healthy children to the world. Basically, all of these were the ideologies based on under utopian society. The Industrial Revolution and socialism. Industrial Revolution, actually, it was almost the same equivalent of the technology revolution that we see, internet, right? Computer revolution that we see. We saw the end of 1990s, and at that time it was the end of 1800, the second half of 1800. They saw the same revolution, which really revolutionized the lifestyle of people at that time. Before that, it was hard labor work, not much consumer goods, because everything was based on labor power, right? Not machines. There was no machine involved. Therefore, the production is not high. So not much focus on consumer goods at all. At that time, probably how many outfit they would have, how many dresses they would have, right? One or two. It was not possible to do that so fast. And now you go to like big shopping malls and or department stores and you see tons of different types of styles. So at that time, it was a time, the end of 1800 was a time that was a huge change for people at that time, which was started with the Industrial Revolution, which included machines and equipment. The start of capitalism society and the gap between poor and rich started increasing. So people who owned business, who owned machines, who owned capital, they could now own the labor as well. Because they did have, remember, there are three types of resources: labor, capital, and land. Now, people who were influential, who were in politics, who had money, they were actually the ones who had capital and land. Now they could own the third type of resources, which was the labor. Now, because of that, the gap between poor and rich started increasing more and more. And of course, the crime rate, and which will lead to utopian ideology. More capital for business owners and very poor condition for low wages for workers. And let's see, what about modern socialism right now, after 1800, later on? A social reform movement to protest the seamy side of the Industrial Revolution. Robert Owen actually was a British business owner who he liked actually the idea of utopian socialism. So what he did, he had a mill. He started his own meal production facility. So he said, I'm going to start with my own business. He did not employ children under 10, reduced the working hours to 10.5 hours per day. So it was even more than that. Increased the wages, and educational and playground was provided to his mill workers. So it was basically a revolution at that time to save a lot of workers with his ideology. So So he was one of the first supporters of utopian society. Now, it talks about the institutions of socialism and then compares it with capitalism. Institution of socialism: private property, prices system, and socialism and government. In socialism, there's no private property, right? The entire country is owned by the government. The entire land, businesses, farms, everything is owned by government. There is no basically trade based on, for example, international trade, import, export based on small businesses. It's only by government decision. There is no price system, of course. Why? Because government basically price system is based on labor work. Because there is no supply and demand, right? There is no competition. If there is no supply and demand, based on supply and demand, or based on competition, how do you price your products? If you price it based on the cost of production, people might not be able to buy it, right? What is the cost of production? That is also owned, everything is owned by government too, right? Government is not paying much to its laborers. So what happens is that it's based on only labor work. That's all how they calculate the price system. Not based on the cost of production, only based on labor. How much government is paying their laborers, which is very minimal, that's how much basically they calculate, and that's how much offered. Money system, it is actually common in the society, but not the control of money. People, citizens of the country, they do receive money, basically for wages, but the control of money is not in their hand. What they want to buy, what they want to do with it, that's not the case. So the control of their money, of their wages, is also based on government. So here it says private property, banks, and large companies could be owned by private and state. This is socialism. Small scale business, that was before. Small scale business and farming are predominantly owned by private sector. This is capitalism. Is this capitalism or? Okay. In the socialism, as I said, socialism, small businesses can be owned by private sector, but not communism, right? So communism is a little bit more extreme than socialism. Socialism, again, very, very small. They have a cap. After that, they have to give it, if it grows bigger, very small businesses, they have to give it to, the profit goes to government. There is no price system at all because the market is not competitive. And socialism and government, their tendency to relate capitalism and democracy was very common at the time. And communism and socialism were actually dictatorship. But in fact, socialism, we see, well, the socialism at that time was very different than the socialism that we see today. Okay? The ideology was different. The socialism that we see today, socio-democratic societies, are Western Europe and Northern Europe in today's world, right? They're called socio-democratic. At that time, what they believed was that socialism and communism, it's only directed with dictators. It's only capitalism that is democracy, which is not true. Today we know it's not true because Western Europe and Northern Europe, they are socio-democratic societies. So they're mixed economies. We don't call them in today's world because socialism is associated with probably utopian ideology. We don't call them socialism, but we say socio-democratic economies. So they're basically for society and they're democratic regimes too. They're actually very, one of the largest democracies in its pure sense. We talked about it as Switzerland, which is the only one in its pure democracy. Is Switzerland, and those countries are all socio-democratic economies. Now, communism, I can say it's related with dictatorship, which was, as we talked about it, remember we said totalitarian regimes, one type of it was communism. Communism is in the extreme type, which is everything is owned by government, all laborers, everybody, citizens are workers of government, they're wage earners, physicians, teachers, everybody earns basically almost the same because everybody is going to consume exactly the same. There's not other consumer products in society. You don't pay rent, you don't pay for your car, nothing. Government pays for everything. So that's basically your wage is earned, but it's not controlled. So today I remember when Bernie Sanders was running, it was a huge misunderstanding among people that he's gonna make the country like communist, we're not gonna be socialist, whatever. First of all, communism, even though I knew it, I was confused to what are these people talking about, because socialism in no way is the same as communism. But if you ask common people in the United States, they will definitely say it's the same thing. Everybody, if you ask just common people outside, they will all say socialism is the same as communism, which they are not, absolutely not. They're very different. Socialism is a mixed economic system, a healthy private sector and a healthy public sector. Now, the reason people make a mistake about socialism and communism is that because in socialism, as we said, there's a healthy public sector, which is natural resources, some natural resources, healthcare, education, transportation, those are owned by government. So therefore, a lot of people will believe that it's overlapping because it's owned by government. No, that's mixed economic system, and that's called socialism, which is also a type of democratic system too. So again, at that time, because of the brutal exploitation of laborers, this ideology, the extreme ideology, started growing as well. Now, communism, that's with Karl Marx. He was actually German. He died, and then he had to flee his country because of fear of his life, and he died in UK. Karl Marx is very famous for his piece of Das Kapital, which is capitalism. Marx's theory of income distribution. So these are his theories. Basically, he says there are three types of productive forces: labor, capital, and land, which we just talked about it. And he says the government or people in power own capital and land, and they actually, if the income distribution is not equal, then the gap between poor and rich will be bigger, right? So the labor has to only work for the government. Now, what he is saying is that if we actually distribute it equally, those farmers will also have their own lands too. Which in communism, in real communism, didn't happen, right? So he believed that farmers should have their own lands. If they're working on a piece of land, that should be their land, not basically their boss or employers. But in real communism, later on, Soviet Union, we've seen that it didn't happen. Everything was owned completely by government and distributed equally to people. Karl Marx believed in labor theory of value. Basically, what he's saying is that everything should be priced based on labor. So he said if a pair of shoes takes basically 2 hours to make, and a table basically takes 5 hours to make, the price of a pair of shoes must be 2/5 of the price of the table. So basically he said everything should be the price of the value of the labor. But in reality, we know the criticism about that. How about skilled laborers, right, versus unskilled laborers? How about the demand? What if there is no demand for that table, right, and there is more demand for the shoes? So he completely avoided all those other factors that are considered in capitalism. Theory of surplus value, which is the power of labor but belongs to the employee. He basically says that when that shoe is sold, for example, if the wages were $2 for the employee, and if the employer is selling it for $4, that $2 extra is the power of the labor that goes to the pocket of employer, right? Because he says it should have been really $2. If you're selling $4 and you're not dividing that $4 between you and your employee, that means it's the power of labor that went to your pocket. So the surplus, the profit basically, he's talking about profit. We all work, but the profit in reality goes to employers. So that's what he was talking about. Then he said weakness of capitalism, more crisis and depression. Again, as we said, in the beginning of century, because of World War I, and then because of depression in 1930s, he focused on that, and he's like, okay, so depression is going to happen more and more, which it really did happen. So he said capitalism will lead to more depression and more ups and downs, and not stability. Weakness of capitalism, more crisis, depression, only small number of large companies will happen. These were all his predictions, and it really happened. He said the world will go to the point that only very few companies, but very large companies, will take over the whole world. So, which it really happened right now. We see like there are only a few very, very large companies around the world, right? Which they literally represent the entire industry, right? I mean, other than restaurant industry, for example, if you think about it. Other stuff like how many oil companies we have. There are not too many. There are like not more than 20 probably oil companies, or not more than 50 all around the world, right? Or automobile companies, or even telecommunication companies. There are just very few, very large companies he predicted will take over the world. The world will face large unemployment, and exploitation of workers by capitalist employers will continue. So basically what he said, I will see in the future that still child labor will be around, will be actually practicing around the world. In reality, right now when we take our jobs and outsource them from here or other developed nations to other countries, and children are working for us, that's exactly the same thing. We didn't do that for like about a period of 50 years, right? Which was like inside the country, and we had like minimum wage, we had labor, child labor laws. But right now that we're taking to other countries, we're going back again to the system of exploitation. Now, weakness of Marxism, these are the criticism of his ideologies. The labor theory of value was basically, again, as I said, it didn't consider the demand, right? What if people would like more of those shoes and not the table? So why are you saying that was more expensive? The other one was skilled versus unskilled laborers. So what if the skillful laborers, they have to work on a piece of very small product, and it takes a very short period of time, but unskillful laborers, they take 5 hours to build a table, for example. How about that? And then fertile land too. The fertile land, they basically said, how about when we talk of fertile land, what if a person has a fertile land? How do you distribute that one? No worker is working on that one. No farmer is working on that one. How do you price it to sell it? How do you use that part? So how do you sell that one? That's why those were actually part of the criticism about Marxist theories. The political and economic system of the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. As we said, like half of from the Berlin Wall towards the east, it was all influenced by communism. Organization of those type of organization of government, how the government is organized in those societies, in communist societies. Central government was only to distribute power among its party members. So we know that it's only one party, right? Only one party rule, and that's communism. Now remember, they started communism because they wanted to give equality to everybody in the country, right? All their citizens. But in reality, that didn't happen. Nomenclatura system was actually an elite system in their country. When they would give power or distribute power among their own party members, what does that mean? That's a type of favoritism, right? So whoever is very strong in the ideology and very close to them in the ideology, they would actually take the power. Now the perks that came with it was that they actually could shop from different government stores, because all the stores are owned by government, right? But these are separate government stores that actually did have some Western products in it too, while everybody else was only using the country's products, right? There's no other production in the country, so everybody's consuming the same thing that they're producing themselves. It was just certain stores in the country, in former Soviet Union, that their elite, nomenclatura, people, elite, could go to those type of stores which you could see Western products in those stores too. They had access to better schools, like universities, and they had basically power, and they were positioned in powerful positions in the government. So they had a little bit, now the housing actually was a little bit better too, because the entire country looks exactly the same as far as the housing. The entire country looks exactly the same because it's all government housing, right? So some government housings that were a little bit better inside, they would give them to nomenclatura people, elites people. The Communist Party and central government were exactly the same, versus like here we have probably in the Senate or in the House, we have Republicans and Democrats, and our president is choosing either Republican or and Democrat, right? In Communist Party is the same. President is the same party, which is Communist Party, Senate the same, Parliament same, House the same, everybody is the same from the same party. So there is no challenging in any rules and regulations. The economic system of socialism, now how the economic system worked. Supply and demand were exactly the same. So how the production worked was that based on the population of the country, they would produce food items. I think I told you guys in this class that they would basically get 2 loaves of bread in the morning and 2 loaves of bread in the afternoon. So based on the population and the consumption need that government believes they need, they would produce the same amount. So there will be no surplus at all. Government production was for mass population. Only one employer is in the country, and that's government, and they produce everything for the mass population. And government focused on industrialization. Again, no farming and no consumer goods anymore, because it was all based on industries, and that was mainly military, that they were very advanced. The 3 timelines, they have 3 actually in communist societies. Their economic planning was based on 3 timelines. One was 15 to 20-year plan. The other one was 5-year plan. And then the last one was 1-year plan. But this one was done every 5 years for each year. But this one was for an entire 5 years. Now, at that time, actually, not even at that time, still today, a lot of countries did that. But basically 2 parties or multiple parties together, not only one party. But it was very common around the world, and it still is, to have like a 20 years plan or 5-year plan or 1-year plan. Usually, it used to be longer. Now they're reducing, unless they want to build a city. For example, when they build a city, now they're thinking about 70 years or 100 years, how it's going to be, or roads or bridges. Other than that, they have reduced their planning timelines because of the fast changes that is happening around the world. Now, state budget in communist countries were much larger than state budget in capitalist societies. Why? Because in capitalist societies, there is private sector and public sector, right? So a lot of budget actually is in the hand of public sector. Versus in capitalist societies, in communist societies, all the budget was in the hand of one party, which was Communist Party, which is the government. So therefore, their government budget was actually much higher than the capitalist budget. That's why they could advance so much in military, because they put all that budget into their military, focus on military. Money and banking, again, money and banking, there was money as a use of medium of exchange, but not control of money. People would receive wages, but you don't control your wages if you want to buy a house or a car. Now, banking, there is only one bank system, which is government bank. There is no private bank.
I'm sorry, can I ask you, if somebody wanted to save little by little wages and eventually get a home, can they do that?
No. There's no home for sale.
Oh, okay.
Everything is owned by government. No.
Okay, so
You don't. No, everything is owned. Even China today, you cannot buy lands. Even today, China, the way that you know China, you cannot buy land. It's only right now, not even 10 years ago, but right now you can buy condos, dwellings. You can buy apartment. Not even 10 years ago. That's how recent it is. But again, it's only condos, so not the land itself. Still, in Vietnam, in China, a lot of countries. So banks are owned all by government and are involved in economic planning, the 5-year planning or 1-year planning that we talked about. Banks were involved too. Prices, labor was the only factor of production, as we talked about it. Prices were not based on supply and demand, and income distribution, it was supposed to be equal, right? That was the whole ideology, to be equal. But we saw that for nomenclatura elite, it was a little bit different, right? So they had a little bit better perks, access to universities, better universities, households, housing. Organization of industry and agriculture in the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. State-controlled mines, power plants, railways, means of communication, banking, foreign trade, channels of distribution, manufacturing, farming. So basically everything, state control. Extensive bureaucratic structure was necessary. Why? Because government, imagine like this university, for example, right? How much bureaucracy it has to be done because they have like 14,000 students, they have faculty, lecturers, anything, staff and all that. There's a lot of bureaucracy because it's a huge organization, right? Think about the whole country that is run as your business, right? So the bureaucracy, like paperwork, it was huge and extensive because in order to be able to control the whole country. Industries were more advanced than the capitalist societies such as the United States. Again, so industry. They only focus on industrial advancement. And again, mainly, next chapter we're going to talk about it, mainly military. They completely ignored their farming. So that's why their farming went down dramatically throughout communism. Agriculture mainly owned and operated by government, state farms and collective farms. So governments took over the farmings after World War II when it became communism. Government took over the entire farming, and government it was not priority for them, right? It was not a main priority. They wanted to only produce as much to